Hello student, welcome in Department of Nanoscience and Nanotechnology SYBSc class. Our today's topic is Introduction to Nanotoxicology. In that, first we will see the physicochemical determinants. First, size. Cytotoxicity is induced by nanomaterials result from the interaction between the nanomaterial surface and cellular components. As the diameter decreases, the surface area of the particle increases exponentially. Thus, even when particles have the same composition, they can have significantly different levels of cytotoxicity depending on both particle size and surface reactivity. Additionally, particle size induces significant differences in the cellular delivery mechanism and distribution in vivo. In this regard, not only are chemical properties and size-dependent cytotoxicity important in assessing a nanomaterial's cytotoxicity, but also is the amount of size-dependent cytotoxicity. Size-dependent absorption. To generate cytotoxicity and inflammatory response in animal models, it is essential that the nanoparticles should migrate across the epithelial barrier. In this respect, the size of the nanoparticles plays a key role in cytotoxicity. In the case of nanoparticle inhalation, nanoparticles penetrate deeply into the lung parenchyma. Different size nanoparticles show specific distribution patterns in the respiratory tract. Nanoparticle distribution is also affected by the Stokes number and Reynolds number. Initially, particles are well distributed in the gas phase, but after inhalation, they translocate into the liquid phase in respiratory fluids. Next is size dependent in vivo pharmacokinetics and clearance. The distribution of a drug or nanoparticles in vivo or pharmacokinetics is also an important consideration in assessing cytotoxicity. Many studies have examined the in vivo distribution of nanomaterials. Nanoparticles with a diameter greater than 6 nanometer cannot be excreted by the kidneys and accumulate in specific organs such as the liver and spleen until clearance by the mononuclear phagocyte system ensues. Most nanoparticles that accumulate in liver and spleen cause serious side effects. For instance, cadmium selenide quantum dots remain in the tissue for up to 8 months and cause hepatotoxicity. This pharmacokinetics characteristic of nanoparticles is dependent on particle size and surface chemistry. Next is size-dependent cellular uptake and cytotoxicity. In terms of cellular interaction, nanoparticle uptake, mechanism and efficiency are key factors influencing cytotoxicity. One of the major factors determining cellular uptake efficiency and mechanism is nanoparticle size. With respect to particle size and surface features, nanoparticles are internalized into the cell through various pathways such as phagocytosis and pinocytosis. Sizes suitable for uptake range from 10 to 500 nanometer with an upper limit of 5 mm. Next physicochemical determinant is surface. In addition to size and surface charge, the particle surface itself also plays a critical role in biological toxicity. First is surface area. Band gap alteration, decreased melting point and higher reactivity induced by a large surface area were investigated, and it was found that these features had serious effects including lung inflammation, cytotoxicity and toxicity in vivo. A large surface area may cause higher reactivity with nearby particles, resulting in possibly harmful effects when used in fillers, cosmetics and as drug carriers. It can be concluded that by decreasing the particle size, its biological activity increases substantially. Smaller particles occupy less volume, such as a large number of particles can occupy a unit area, resulting in increased pathophysiological toxicity mechanisms. For instance, oxidative stress, ROS generation, mitochondrial perturbation, etc. It has yet to be determined what features of nanoparticles cause such biological toxicity. There were no significant differences in toxicity differences based on size. However, the total surface area played a critical role in lung inflammation. It has been clearly confirmed that pulmonary toxicity assessed after treatment with several particles including carbon black, titanium dioxide, etc. may be induced by ultrafine and fine materials which have a large surface areas. Particle surface reactivity characterized by how easily single particle aggregate may also play a significant role in cytotoxicity. It has also been suggested that dosing should be based on nanoparticle surface area. Then surface electrostatic status. Due to their small size, nanoparticles are usually used as a drug carrier via either passive or active transport. Their effective cellular internationalization depends upon biocompatibility. In particular, external properties of surface electronic status are critical to cellular uptake and may also be involved in cytotoxicity. Traditionally, to study in vitro efficacy, nanocarriers are instilled into a 2D layered target cell for both therapeutic and diagnostic studies. Changes in surface charge result in considerable differences in the in vivo biodistribution of nanoparticles. Even though some nanoparticles including polymeric nanocomplexes and gold nanospheres have the same range of size variations. Particles show different degrees of toxicity depending on their surface charges. Nanoparticles with a positively charged surface tended to have much higher toxicity. Then what is hydrophobicity? Hydrophobic literally means the fear of water. Hydrophobic molecules and surfaces repel water. Hydrophobic liquids such as oil will separate from water. Hydrophobic molecules are usually non-polar, meaning the atom that make the molecule do not produce a static electric field. In polar molecules, these opposite regions of electrical energy attract to water molecules. Without opposite electrical charges on the molecules, water cannot form hydrogen bonds with the molecules. The water molecules then form more hydrogen bonds with themselves and the non-polar molecules clump together. The hydrophobic effect is caused by non-polar molecules clumping together. Large macromolecules can have hydrophobic sections which will fold the molecules so they can be close to each other, away from water. Many amino acids in proteins are hydrophobic, helping the proteins obtain their complicated shapes. The hydrophobic effects extend to organisms as many hydrophobic molecules on the surface of an organism help them regulate the amount of water and nutrients in their systems. Example of hydrophobic. First one is cell membranes. Cell membranes are made of macromolecules known as phospholipids. Phospholipids have phosphorus atoms in the heads of the molecules which attract water. The tail of the molecule is made of lipids which are hydrophobic molecules. The hydrophilic heads point towards water and the hydrophobic tails attract toward each other. In small groups, phospholipids form micelles. A micelle is a small hydrophobic ball. The hydrophobic tails expel water from the center of the ball. Cell membranes are composed of two phospholipid layers known as the phospholipid bilayer. The middle of the sheet is made of hydrophobic tails which expel water and can separate the contents of the cell from the outside environment. Cells have a variety of special protein embedded into the membrane which help transport hydrophilic molecules like water and ions across the hydrophobic middle portion of the membrane. In eukaryotic cells, organelles are formed inside the cells from smaller sacs created from phospholipid bilayers. Scientists have used the hydrophobic properties of phospholipids to create another structure to deliver medicine and nutrients to cells. Liposomes are small sacs that can be filled with medicines. With the right proteins, embedded into the membrane, the liposome will merge with the membrane of target cell and deliver the medicine to the inside of the cell. Next example is plant leaves. Many plants have hydrophobic coatings on their leaves. It is important that rain and water are not absorbed through the leaves as they would disrupt the flow of nutrients which rely on the passage of water from root to leaf. If the water were allowed to travel by osmosis through the cell membrane and into the leaf, it would change the osmotic pressure in the leaves and water could not travel up from the roots. Even aquatic plants protect their leaves with hydrophobic substances which ensures nutrients are pulled from the roots and water flows in one direction through the plant. Next example of hydrophobic is bird feathers. Many aquatic birds must protect their feather from water intrusion and secrete hydrophobic oils onto their feathers, which keeps water from penetrating. If you have ever heard the term like water of a duck, that phrase refers to the hydrophobicity of duck feathers. Ducks and many other aquatic birds spend a considerable amount of time underwater collecting food. However, they must also fly when they exit the water. If water was allowed to penetrate their feathers, the birds would become too heavy to fly. The birds brush the hypophobic oils they secrete from their skin and special glands onto their feathers. When they dive underwater, the oil form a hydrophobic barrier that keeps water from penetrating. Then when they emerge, they simply shake the water off and are able to fly. Next topic is routes of exposure. There are numerous exposure scenarios depending on the particulars of manufacture, use and discarding. All through these scenarios, the levels of exposure, the population exposed, the duration of exposure and the nature of the material to which people are exposed are completely different. In an industrial situation, exposure to nanomaterials can happen to workers at all phases of material life cycle. During the development of a new material, it is possible that material will be manufactured under strongly controlled conditions, usually in very little quantities. Once the material moves into commercial production, exposures can occur potentially during synthesis of the material or in downstream activities such as packaging, transport, recovery and storage. Nanomaterials may also be integrated into a composite material which may be consequently re-engineered or reprocessed by cutting, finishing. Once again, in these conditions, the potential for exposure exists. Release of nanomaterials into the environment is possible as waste or industrial pollution directly into the air, soil or water systems or due to purposeful release in applications such as remediation of contaminated lands. Hence, humans may become exposed as a result of contamination in air, water, or the food chain, or during the use of commercial products containing nanomaterials. In view of human exposure for all of these scenarios, it is compulsory to think about the route of entry into the human body. There are some of the various human exposures such as skin, respiratory tract, gastrointestinal tract. So, first we will see is skin. The significance of dermal exposure to dangerous substances continues to rise. Detrimental effects arising from skin exposure may either happen locally within the skin or alternatively the substance may be absorbed through the skin and circulated via the bloodstream, probably causing systematic effects. Skin is the major primary defense organ in the human body and directly comes into contact with many lethal agents. Skin exposure to engineered nanomaterials can also occur during the purposeful application of topical creams and other drug treatments. Information on in vivo uptake of Ag nanoparticles due to dermal exposure are limited, partly caused by the lack of appropriate analytical approaches for the determination of Ag in biological matrices, but strongly needed to enable risk assessment of skin exposure to nanosilver containing products. Nanotitanium dioxide is one of the most frequently used materials being synthesized, and due to the extensive application of titanium dioxide nanoparticles and their inclusion in many commercial products, the increased exposure of human beings to nanoparticles is possible. These TiO2 particles could get through the human stratum, corneum, and get to epidermis and even dermis. It has been proved that engineered nanoparticles like quantum dots, single or multi-wall carbon nanotubes with nanoscale titania and surface coatings have lethal effects on fibroblast and epidermal keratinocytes and are competent of altering their gene or protein expression. Second is oral respiratory tract. The respiratory system provides the major doorway for ambient particulate materials, and the diseases resulting from airborne particle materials like asbestos, spots, and carbon have long been keenly investigated in clinical and environmental medicine. In recent times, the pathogenic effects and pathology of inhaled engineered nanoparticles are seized the attention of researchers. Nanoparticles deposition in the pulmonary system differs considerably according to the granulometry of nanoparticles and their airborne behavior. Particle granulometry has a foremost impact on the pulmonary deposition site. In many nanoparticle production processes, the granulometry can also vary significantly according to the stage of production. These differences in nanoparticle distribution in the lungs may have major consequences on the health effects of inhaled nanoparticle particles and the elimination mechanisms involved. In the alveolar region, the macrophages will take up the insoluble particles by phagocytosis. However, the effectiveness of phagocytosis is barely dependent on nanoparticle shape and size. Several studies have proved that polyethylene nanoparticles of general nanoscale size deposited in the alveolar region are not phagocyted efficiently by the macrophages. However, the macrophages are especially efficient for coarser particles in the 1 to 3 micrometer range. After the deposition of nanoparticles in the alveolar region, they are absorbed across the lung epithelium. Later, they enter the blood and lymph to reach cells in the lymph nodes, bone marrow, spleen, and heart. Further targets after translocation include the sensory nerve endings surrounded in the airway epithelia, followed by ganglia and the central nervous system by means of axons. It is demonstrated that aggregated silver nanoparticles and some other nanoparticles are cytotoxic to alveolar macrophages cells as well as epithelial lung cells. It was proved by both inhalation and instillation experiments that nanoparticles were taken up by alveolar macrophages to some extent, and aggregated silver nanoparticles preserve there for up to 7 days. Results of in vitro studies indicate a dose-dependent programmed cell death included by oxidative stress as main possible pathway of toxicity by silver nanoparticles. In addition, silver nanoparticles may influence cellular enzymes by interference with free thiol groups and mimicry of endogenous ions. Next is gastrointestinal tract. Gastrointestinal tract acts as an organ system responsible for consuming and digesting foodstuff, absorbing nutrients as well as expelling waste. Nanomaterials can reach the gastrointestinal tract by ingesting directly in water, food, cosmetics, drugs, and drug delivery devices, or after mucociliary clearance from the respiratory tract via nasal region. In addition, increased utilization of nanoparticles may lead to increased environmental contamination and unintentional ingestion via water, food animals or fish. It is measured that the exogenous sources of ingestion exposure mainly results from hand to mouth contact in the workplace. On the other hand, NPS can be ingested directly via food, water, drinking drugs, and drug delivery systems. Besides, nanoparticles cleared from respiratory tract via the mucociliary escalator can then be ingested into the gastrointestinal tract. Thus, gastrointestinal tract is considered as vital target for nanoparticles exposure. Assessment of nanoparticles must taken into deliberation not only for absorption and extraintestinal organ accumulation but also the potential for altered gut microbes and the effects of this perturbation on the host. Gastrointestinal tract is a highly complex environment and undertaking of the fate of ingested nanoparticles requires consideration of multiple factors. Many features have been identified that are significant to interpretation of nanoparticles ingestion studies, and these studies include physicochemical characterization of nanoparticles and reporting of metadata from in vivo studies. Moreover, a characteristic somewhat exceptional to the ingestion route is the possible for toxic effects related to interactions with the gut microbiome. In the end, although doses higher than distinctive exposures are a standard and essential part of toxicity studies for establishing dose range parameters, these doses should be reasonably based and critically compared to probable exposure levels. Next is injection. The most widely investigated exposure pathway for nanotherapeutics is injection. Nanoparticle injectables have been explored because they could potentially eliminate the negative side effects of traditional injectable drugs, particularly chemotherapy, where solubility and stability of drug molecules limit their use. In fact, most of the approved nanoproducts are aimed at cancer diagnosis or therapy, as are many injectable nanomaterials in development. Therefore, many of the models for in vivo injection nanotoxicity are implanted cancer cells to stimulate tumor development, and in vitro studies generally use cancerous cell lines, though it is possible to use similar cancerous cell lines as those implanted to create the in vivo tumor. Few studies take this route. Some in vitro work has examined primary culture cells from blood, such as platelets or red blood cells, to determine blood compatibility. Since a major aim of injectable nanotherapeutics has been to treat cancer, much of the in vivo toxicity assessments focus on the nanoparticle uptake into tumor, followed by various characterization of the progression of cancer along with the systemic biodistribution of administered nanoparticles to assess clearance and potential sites of unintentional toxicity. These in vivo studies are correlated with in vitro viability assays that assess the percentage of cells, often cancer cells, that survive nanoparticle or drug-loaded nanoparticle exposure. Next is risk evaluation both in vitro and in vivo studies. The ultimate goal of evaluating the safety of nanomaterials is risk assessment and establishment of safe levels for human exposure or intake. Risk is a function of hazard and exposure, and short-term goals of toxicity testing and directed at defining a hazard, which then together with exposure data can be used for risk assessment purpose. A very long-term goal is to directly use results of in vitro assays for predicting safe human exposures. Next is immunohistochemistry or IHC. It is the process whereby antibodies are used to detect proteins in cells within a tissue section. When a tissue sample is passed to a lab to be examined for disease, there are several details that cannot be determined easily. Several diseases or disease subtypes may look alike or appear to have similar sized cells under a microscope but have different behaviors and necessary treatments. The best way to differentiate them is to detect specific molecules on these cells that acts as markers. Immunohistochemistry is a technique that uses antibodies that can seek out, identify, and attach themselves to these markers on cells. The antibodies themselves can be seen under the microscope, which helps the technician make a precise identification. Immunohistochemistry has found numerous applications in medicine, especially in cancer diagnosis. Lymphomas are among the cancer most dependent on IHC for correct diagnosis and treatment decisions. Using the principle of antibodies binding specifically to antigens in biological tissues to detect the antigen in cells of a tissue section. Immunohistochemistry is a process used to diagnose some types of cancer, including mesothelioma. The procedure involves locating antigens in biopsy tissue through the use of a visual marker. Common markers include fluorescent dye, enzymes, colloidal gold, and radioactive elements. If cellular events associated with cancerous tumors, such as an increase in cell death, are evident in the tissue, then the abnormal activity will be highlighted by the stained tissue sample. Immunohistochemistry cannot only help in the identification of a tumor, but it can also distinguish whether or not a tumor is benign or malignant. Then, IHC history. The principle of IHC has existed since the 1930s, but it was not until 1941 that the first IHC study was reported. Kunz and his co-workers used fluorescein isothiocyanate label antibodies to localized pneumococcal antigens in infected tissues. Since then, with improvement and development of protein conjugation, enzyme labels have been introduced such as peroxidase and alkaline phosphatase. Colloidal gold label has also been discovered and used to identify immunohistochemical reactions at both light and electron microscopy levels. Other labels include radioactive elements, and the immunoreaction can be visualized by autoradiography. All of these make immunohistochemistry a routine and essential tool in diagnostic and research laboratories. Then IHC analysis. IHC analysis is a method for demonstrating the presence and location of proteins in tissue sections. Though less sensitive quantitatively than immunoassays such as Western blotting, it enables the observation of processes in the context of intact tissue. This is especially useful for assessing the progression and treatment of diseases such as cancer. In general, the information gained from IHC combined with microscopy literally provides a big picture that can help make sense of data obtained using other methods. Immunohistochemical staining is accomplished with antibodies and recognize the target protein. Since antibodies are highly specific, the antibody will bind only to the protein of interest in the tissue section. The antibody-antigen interaction is then visualized using either chromogenic detection, in which an enzyme conjugated to the antibody cleaves a substrate to produce a colored precipitate at the location of the protein, or fluorescent detection, in which a fluorophore is conjugated to the antibody and can be visualized using fluorescence microscopy. Next is IHC principle. Immunohistochemistry is a wide-use biological technique that combines anatomy, physiology, immunology, and biochemistry. developed from the antigen-antibody binding reaction. Immunohistochemistry can be considered as a method that visualizes distribution and localization of specific antigen or cellular components in separated tissues or tissue sections. Compared to other biotechniques that are based on the antigen-antibody reaction, precipitation such as immunoprecipitation or Western blot, immunohistochemistry provides information which promises a more convincing experimental result. Major components in a complete immunohistochemistry experiments are primary antibody binds to specific antigen and the antibody antigen complex is formed by incubation with a secondary enzyme conjugated antibody, and with presence of substrate and chromogen the enzyme catalyzes to generate colored deposits at the sites of antibody antigen binding. Then immunohistochemical methods. The enzymatic method for immunohistochemistry uses reagents like calcium chloride, sodium hydroxide, hydrochloric acid solution, xylanes for dewaxing, and methanol. Immunohistochemistry uses different staining procedures such as one-step direct method, ABC method, two-step indirect method, and thyramide signal amplification. Then applications of IHC. Immunohistochemistry using the basic principle of immunology, the antigen-antibody reaction, namely antigen and antibody specific binding principle by chemical reaction of the label antibody reagent to confirm the antigens in tissues, its location, qualitative and quantitative research called immunohistochemistry. It combines the specific of immune response with visibility of histochemistry by means of a microscope, imaging and amplification, detection of various antigens in cell subcellular levels such as proteins, polypeptides, enzymes, hormones, pathogens and receptors. Immunohistochemical techniques have developed rapidly in recent years. It is an important application of monoclonal and polyclonal antibodies in order to determine the distribution of the target protein in the of health and disease tissues. IHC is widely used for diagnosis of cancers. Since IHC involves specific antigen antibody reactions, it has apparent advantage over traditionally used special enzymes staining techniques that identify only a limited number of proteins, enzymes, and tissue structures. Therefore, IHC has become a crucial technique and is widely used in many medical research laboratories as well as clinical diagnostics. Then some definitions. First one is histopathology. It is the examination of tissues from the body under a microscope to spot a signs and characteristics of disease. Histology is the study of tissue and pathology is the study of disease. A surface is hydrophilic if it tends to absorb water or be wetted by water. Then mortality. It is a measure of the number of deaths in a particular population scaled to the size of that population per unit of time. A mortality rate is the number of deaths during a particular period of time among a particular type or group of people. Thank you.